you go out to dinner with friends, the conversation no doubt covers a lot of ground. Sometimes, I like to launch into discussions of politics, economics, and the Washington Nationals baseball team. These are the types of dinner conversations I like best, when ideas are flowing around the table. Good friends, good food, good wine, and good conversation make the evening for me. So next time you're at dinner, try this. Try pulling out your smartphone, putting it on the table, and saying, "Hey, this conversation is great. I'd really like to record it. Does anyone mind?" And then watch what happens. My guess is that the conversation will grind to a halt. At a minimum, all the buzz will go out of it. Why is that? The answer, I think, can be found in the example of the British philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who proposed erecting a jail in a circular form with a watchman at the center and the residents of the jail on the periphery. In this way, one person could keep a careful eye on everyone else. Bentham called this building the Panopticon, and the reaction of those under observation has come to be known as the Panopticon effect. That's what I want to talk about today, the effect that observation has on our conduct. Some of these effects are bad ones, no doubt, but observation and transparency also produce some social benefits. We'll also flip the lens around to look at social behavior when it's anonymous, again with positive and negative effects. And finally, I'd like to address one other aspect of this phenomenon, which is the effect that observation, or surveillance, has on the watchman himself. Most Western governments don't take prurient interest in their citizens' private lives, and a wide range of safeguards normally are erected to maintain this healthy barrier. But social science tells us that harm can happen even when the government is not actively looking over our shoulders. There is, we learn, a self-editing effect that arises from the mere perception of scrutiny. Maybe not a great deal of self-editing among many people, but sometimes those who lead lives on the edges of social convention, politically, culturally, or behaviorally, may edit their actions out of a concern for how they will be perceived. But the observer effect is as real in social structures as it is in physics. That's why schools have proctors in exam rooms, for example. The very specter of surveillance and its effects on behavior can be characterized by some as a cognizable harm to their liberty. Here's some of the social science we know. One study in New Jersey during the 1990s found a direct correlation between how workers perceived surveillance in the workplace and how they assessed their own privacy, self-esteem, and workplace communications. The greater the level of perceived surveillance, the more negative the work environment was thought to be. In the 1950s, at the height of anti-communist feelings during the Cold War, government employees and professors in Washington, D.C. came under closer scrutiny. As a result, many of them withdrew from non-governmental organizations, canceled subscriptions to magazines, declined to participate in petition drives, and became more cautious in their conversations with strangers. This reflects, on a smaller scale, the same reaction to surveillance as seen in other nations where surveillance is overt and more pervasive. Likewise, as the British historian Mary Fulbrook put it in her study of East Germany, which she titled "The People's State," the state security ministry, known as Stasi, appears to have been simply taken for granted as a fact of life, in light of which certain precautions had to be taken, which, for some individuals, undoubtedly meant major restrictions on their activities. But the observer effect is more widespread than what arises from gross and intrusive surveillance. One study by the Australian academic Shane Dawson, who specializes in social network analysis, looked at how institutional surveillance technologies affected student behavior in educational environments. Dawson found that the students' internet browsing behaviors, as well as the range of topics they discussed in online forums and the writing styles they employed, were influenced by the degree to which they understood their activities to be under surveillance by the educational institution. Roughly half of the students knew, for example, that the professors monitored student discussion forums for inappropriate comments. And those students who were aware that they were subject to such scrutiny sometimes changed what they posted and how they posted it. I think it's worth noting that the adverse effects of observation are not limited to government surveillance. In our ever more transparent society, which is galvanized by the proliferation of social media, the malign effects of public observation are often on display, most notably through acts of public shaming. The British journalist John Ronson cataloged some aberrant instances in his book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed. He tells the story, for example, of Justine Sacco, a New Yorker who tweeted an offensive joke to her followers just before boarding a long airplane flight to South Africa. That was not the best course of action, to be sure, but what followed far exceeded any proportionate response. Her tweet was retweeted, and it went viral, until she became the #1 trending topic on Twitter, with millions watching. As one person wrote before she landed 18 hours later, quote, "We are about to watch this @Justine Sacco bitch get fired in real time before she even knows she's getting fired," end quote. She did lose her job and suffered months of online harassment, far harsher punishment, I think, than one very poorly thought out tweet deserved. Alice Marwick, a postdoctoral researcher in social media at Microsoft, calls this type of public monitoring social surveillance. She has documented how it has behavioral modification effects on teens who have profiles on social networks. Because of the observer effect, these teens consciously shape their external image and modify their online behavior, mostly to satisfy the social pressure of other teens. Many users of Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Snapchat, Foursquare, and other Web 2.0 sites are constantly monitoring what their social circle is up to. Some conformity is the inevitable result. We also see more surreptitious social surveillance, best exemplified by the self-explanatory phrase, Facebook stalking. A jealous boyfriend, for example, might watch over his girlfriend's Twitter feed to see what she is up to. Microsoft's Marwick reports one instance of a young woman looking at the page of the girl that her ex-boyfriend was dating after they'd broken up. The young woman is quoted as saying, "It makes me feel good because I don't think she's very pretty. That's why I look at her pictures and I'm like, that's okay." Our instinct is always to observe and to judge others. That's the dark side of the Panopticon, no matter who wields the watcher's spectacles. In a review of Ronson's book on public shaming, the journalist Christine Rosen wrote that the stories it tells reveal just how swift, permanent, and often deeply unfair our judgments of one another can be. These public shamings, distributed via social media, are commentaries that we hope never to read about ourselves. But certainly, everyone has something to hide. The watchman's observing eye can also, of course, have positive effects. One notable place we've seen this is in the phenomenon is the action of corporations subject to public scrutiny under the law. So-called right-to-know laws often mandate that companies disclose sensitive details about their operations, how much of a pollutant, for example, they discharge into a local river. These laws have had the salutary effect of driving pollution reduction without legal mandate. One instructive example is found in New Jersey. There, the Community Right to Know law, combined with the 1991 Pollution Prevention Program, did not mandate toxic air emission reductions. Instead, the laws required only public disclosure. Facilities were required to prepare pollution prevention plans and submit plan summaries for how they were going to reduce pollution to the government. The plans would be followed up with a progress report towards the reduction goals to be submitted every year. In other words, each company had to publicly report how much it polluted and whether or not it was making progress in reducing pollution. The results were striking. Between 1987 and 1994, a span that begins before the law was adopted and continues 3 years after its enactment, New Jersey companies subject to the law reduced their production-related waste by 50%. And then between 1994 and 2001, there was an additional 26% reduction of waste products. This, I think, demonstrates that public observation, a form of mass surveillance, if you will, can have a positive effect on societally undesirable behavior. So too with government surveillance of the citizenry. And here I'm not talking about the obvious cases where the government is watching criminals. Rather, we need to acknowledge that sometimes governments can produce social benefits with surveillance and data collection. Consider a few examples from the health and disaster recovery fields. In 2014, Ebola raged in Western Africa. More than 4,000 people died during the early stages of the outbreak. Doctors fought to stem the flood, aided by big data. You see, they used mobile phones owned by West Africans, and the phones themselves were equipped with geolocation capabilities. That is, the ability to broadcast the unit's geographic location. Doctors fighting Ebola put these capabilities to good use in combating the illness. As the BBC reported, Orange Telecom in Senegal handed over anonymized voice and text data from 150,000 mobile phones to a Swedish nonprofit organization known as Flowminer, which was able to draw up detailed maps of population movements in the regions. Using this data, the authorities figured out the best places to set up treatment centers. They also identified which areas to quarantine. Likewise, in the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, researchers from Columbia University and Karolinska Institute in Sweden analyzed more than 2 million calls made by Haitians on their mobile phones. In responding to the disaster, aid workers used this analysis to understand population movements during the initial relief operations and the subsequent cholera outbreak. This helped them pinpoint the neediest areas to which they could direct their doctors and medicine. It also meant they could predict which areas of the country were at increased risk of new cholera outbreaks, allowing them to get ahead of the curve. In the same way, 15 million phones in Kenya provided data and clues that health workers could use to map and predict the spread of malaria in that East African country. Let's turn now to the flip side of the equation. What does social science tell us about human behavior when we aren't being observed? As you might well expect, some of the evidence suggests that in the absence of a watchful eye, anonymity fosters aberrantly bad behavior. But in other ways, anonymity allows for positive social engagement. Let's take the bad side of the coin first, since it's likely the one you are most familiar with. We commonly recognize that anonymous actors are ruder and more abusive than those who we can identify. The most common place we see this is in the cyber domain, where anonymity is common. This effect is sometimes known as the online disinhibition effect. Social norms that are present in face-to-face conversations seem to disappear in the cyber world. The online disinhibition effect is not unique to the internet. We saw it with the advent of CB radio decades ago. As Kenneth Tynan described it in the New Yorker magazine, quote, Your ears are assaulted by the sound of racism at its most rampant, and by masturbation fantasies that are the oral equivalent of rape. The anonymity of CB encourages monsters to emerge. You need look no further than the next lane in traffic to sometimes capture glimpses of driver aggression, in circumstances unlikely to be repeated were the two of you passing on a sidewalk. We aren't sure exactly where this lack of inhibition comes from. To be sure, some of it stems from anonymity. Some also stems from the related, yet distinct problem of invisibility. If you can't see me, you can't see the social cues I'm sending. And if I can't see you, I can't know who you are, so I can't relate to you. A third cause is sometimes called asynchronicity. We aren't talking to each other in the same place at the same time. That makes it easy to leave a message that is volatile and inflammatory and then just disappear. Still, other sources of the lack of inhibition might be the idea of fantasy. Many see conversations in cyberspace as seeming less real than in the real world. Some people see it as a second world where life is just a game, and the regular rules of conduct, like obligations of honesty and kindness, don't apply. The sad rise of cyberbullying is a particularly unfortunate example of such harmful behavior. One of the most distressing cases I know of involves criminal charges against the subscriber to a social network who, in violation of the terms of service, signed up under a pseudonym. This is the infamous Lori Drew case. Lori Drew is a woman whose daughter was having a fight with another teenager. In response, Drew created a fake account on MySpace, an early rival to Facebook, and she used it to verbally abuse the teenager with whom her daughter was at odds. The harassed teenager ultimately committed suicide when federal authorities charged Drew with a crime, specifically with violating the website's terms of service under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. A federal judge later dismissed the case, which was probably the right result under the law. Still, it's hard to imagine that Drew would have engaged in the same aggressive behavior in a face-to-face meeting with the young woman. As a mother herself, she might have argued with the young woman, berated her, or even made a bigger scene. But the outcome, we can hope, would not have been so tragic. Another troubling example of malevolent anonymity is the growth of the phenomenon known as revenge porn. It involves jilted lovers who publish sexually explicit pictures of their former paramours without consent. Often, the photos are accompanied by identifying information, names and addresses, say. Even though that conduct is increasingly subject to criminalization, it continues. Anonymity makes it harder to identify bad actors, and so they continue to act badly. Now let's turn to some of the good that comes from anonymity. First, let me offer an example from the Journal of Consumer Research, which draws on research by Professors Keith Wilcox of Columbia University and Andrew T. Stephen of the University of Pittsburgh. These academics found that in social networks that allow for anonymity, as in the use of pseudonymous screen names or handles, people tend to present a positive self-image of themselves to others. This leads to increases in self-esteem, albeit while also tending to reduce self-control somewhat. So this is a different way of looking at the same anonymity issue, which until now we've displayed in a darker light. The conclusion of Wilcox and Stephen is pretty positive. In their view, people post comments on Facebook that they would probably never say aloud, not because they're mean, but because they feel empowered. Wilcox said this to the Wall Street Journal. Think of it as a licensing effect. You feel good about yourself, so you feel a sense of entitlement. An even more detailed study of how anonymity enhances privacy in some ways comes to us from Benjamin Wittes and Jody Liu of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. They looked, for example, at Google. Google runs some fairly intrusive analytics that unmask your privacy and let the company build a picture about who you are. But Google also offers us a veil of privacy so that you can search for sensitive information of interest from the security of your own home, without anyone else, neither your spouse nor your parents, knowing what topics you are interested in. So Wittes and Liu looked at one functionality of Google to see how it might positively reflect and enhance privacy through partial anonymity. This is the feature known as autocomplete. You've probably seen it in operation. If you start to type a phrase into the Google search bar, the company's algorithms try to predict what you're looking for and automatically generate suggested completions for the phrase. Although Google's analytic system is proprietary, it's fair to say that the popularity of a search plays a large role in the autocomplete function. The phrases and search terms that are suggested typically are ones that many people have expressed interest in already. So if you type in symptoms, the suggested completions might be of strep throat or of high blood pressure. No surprise there. However, it turns out that people are remarkably candid in talking to Google. If you type in, "I think I am," some of the suggestions Google might reply to you with are pregnant, depressed, bipolar, gay, and crazy. Type in, "I'm confused about," and you might get back "my gender," "my religion," or "my sexuality." And if you ask, "Was I?" some common completions are molested as a child and sexually assaulted, according to the research by Wittes and Liu. The top answers for embarrassed to ask for are all related to sexuality as well: condoms, Viagra, Plan B, and birth control. All that's revealing. It tells us some of what people are most concerned about. But it also tells us something about perceptions of privacy. For it is at least some indication that when we feel invisible, we are, as Wilcox and Stevens said, empowered. We're empowered to ask questions about ourselves and our conduct that we might not want others to know about. If you doubt the premise, consider this last example, also from Wittes and Liu. The soft porn bondage book, 50 Shades of Grey, was at one time the worldwide bestseller. It sold more copies in England than the top-selling Harry Potter book. But you almost never saw anyone carrying around a hard copy. That's because e-book versions were outselling paper copies by more than 6 to 1 on Amazon. That is a reflection of the fact that many in society were massively interested in the topic, worried about how others might perceive that interest, and empowered by the comparative invisibility of online purchasing to satisfy their interests with a reduced fear of adverse social judgment. Finally, let's turn to the psychological effects that we might see in the observers themselves. These are the effects that arise specifically from being in a position to watch. In the movie The Lives of Others, about East Germany's Stasi system of state surveillance, a crucial transformation takes place in the psyche of the watcher, Gerd Weisler. At the start of the movie, he is a loyal party spy. By the end, the intrusiveness of his own watching and listening has changed him, so much so that he betrays the state Communist Party and, we like to think, finds his soul. Though one might hope to imagine that the psychological effect of being a watcher is always so salutary, sadly we know that isn't the case. Among the best recent evidence for the bleak downside is the stress registered by some surveillance drone operators, whom we can think of as a contemporary technology-empowered observer. For years, psychologists thought that post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, arose from fear conditioning. That is, from the lasting psychological ramifications of mortal terror. Drone pilots typically don't experience that fear. They're physically safe, far away from the battlefield. But some suffer from PTSD, nevertheless, not because of any physical violence inflicted on them, but rather due to their sensitivity to the violence they witness inflicted on others, or perhaps even reflecting the watchman's failure or inability to do anything about it. As one drone pilot has been quoted as saying, "I really have no fear. It's more like I've had a soul-crushing experience, an experience that I thought I'd never have. I was never prepared to take a life." An Air Force study of 600 combat drone operators reinforced that perspective. As reported in GQ magazine, 42% of the drone crews assessed reported moderate to high stress, and 20% reported emotional exhaustion and burnout. Not all observers suffer equally. Many, it seems, are readily able to disassociate themselves from what they are seeing and doing. Somehow, for example, many of the guards at Nazi concentration camps during World War II were able to internalize the horrific depredations they administered. Attitudes like that are what led the German political theorist Hannah Arendt to famously characterize the lead Nazi exterminator, Adolf Eichmann, with the phrase, "the banality of evil." Eichmann, and others like him, expressed no outward effect from observing and orchestrating the greatest atrocities. It's a result that most of us find extremely puzzling and very disturbing. My last example is from perhaps the most famous social science experiment ever, the Milgram experiments. I'm sure you've heard of them. They test obedience to authority. The Milgram experiments consisted of a series of psychological tests performed in the early 1960s by Stanley Milgram at Yale University. Volunteers were divided into groups of teachers and learners. And the teachers were put in the position of applying electric shocks, supposedly to stimulate better learning. The governing idea of the experiment was that each time the learner responded to a question with the wrong answer, the teacher was to shock the subject, and the level of electric shocks was to increase with each incorrect response. The teacher, who was the real subject of the test, was given one small shock early on, a real one, so that he or she would understand what the shocks felt like. But in reality, the teacher did not administer any electricity to the learner, who was in on the test. The shocks weren't real. Still, as the test went on, the learner would yell and scream and bang on the wall to get the unsuspecting teacher to stop. If the teacher did want to stop, he was directed not to by an authority figure, the person who was in charge of the experiment. The authority figure would say things like, "The experiment requires that you continue," or "You have no other choice. You must go on." In Milgram's experiment, 65% of the teachers ultimately consented to administer massive 450-volt shocks, which would have been fatal to the learner had they been real. The experiment's been repeated countless times in other venues and in other countries. In each instance, approximately 60 to 65% of the test subjects go to the final voltage level under orders from the experimenter. The scenario has been subject to much criticism as unethical or immoral, but it stands nevertheless as a chilling reminder that the effects on the observer are often less pronounced than on the observed. As with most issues of psychology, the overall sum of evidence is somewhat inconclusive. But it's fair to say that the evidence confirms our instincts. We certainly see ways in which observation can enforce good behavior, but it also creates incentives for excess. As we saw, New Jersey's community right to know law helped reduce toxic waste. But when it came to the workplace, state residents said the greater the surveillance was of them, the more negative they found the work environment. If it was you at the dinner table making a joke about taping a friendly conversation, you might be the one loudest to laugh. And if it was the person next to you, you might instinctively respond suspiciously, or at the least very cautiously. The parable of the Panopticon, the circular jail, is a provocative stage on which the tension between the observer and the observed plays out. And how you feel might very well depend on whether you are the one observing or being observed.